presentation for the foreign affairs presentation on Africa. The first article I would be talking about is the hidden threat to globalization. The author argues that there seems to be a decline in support for both wealthy countries and developing countries. Factors to the negative support of globalization include an economic disproportion between low-skilled workers and high-skilled workers, unkept promises by policymakers in both developing and wealthy countries. Policymakers make promises such as more jobs and higher wages and more buying power for investments. However, it doesn't really fall through. Wealthier countries argue that there is a decrease in jobs as more migrants begin to move to wealthier countries. However, response from developing countries such as Africa, their support dropped from 88 to 76% between 2002 and 2021. And then they can respond by restricting access to their market. And if they do restrict access to their market, it can cause an inflation, as well as the products that they create can become expensive. And solutions that the article proposes is requiring supply chains to unionize, having economic reforms in developing countries that will protect workers' rights, and then public investment from policymakers, such as investment in education and training. And then in the article, Wealthier World, Poor Nation, the article argues that wealthier countries argue that there's a rise in migrants, and which is causing an economic inequality. However, the global pattern has shifted since the 1980s to now. There seems to be an increase in wages for Africa as they became a major exporter. And according to the United Nations, income inequality in developing countries increased by 11% between 1990 and 2010. So there still seems to be income inequality for both developing countries and wealthy countries. However, in wealthier countries, the top 1% still continue to build more wealth, while those in the middle class still continue to struggle. And according to Pew Research Center, 61% of U.S. adults that have lived in middle-class household in 1971, while that had changed, that portion had dropped by 50% in 2014. And part of it has to do because businesses are now offshoring their production overseas. And so solutions that the article proposes is revising a governance institution for developing countries, because the IMF and the World Bank are still Euro and American leaders. And so the article proposes that developing countries such as Africa should be a part of that discussion, as well as including basic healthcare, social security, and housing for developing countries to combat income inequality. And then in filling Africa's data gap, the article explains how Africa is struggling with outdated technology, as there's outdated data from the World Bank. And usually in Africa, there's political promises from the U.S., such as improving the energy crisis and investing towards infrastructure. But because their technology is outdated, foreign investors aren't able to see their return on investment. And so challenges in Africa include having lack of infrastructure and not having the ability to combat climate change. The article also highlights that Africa is having a population growth, which can improve their labor supply. However, to be able to have population growth, they need to have more infrastructure. And so, solutions that the article provides is making sure that the data from the World Bank is updated, prioritizing infrastructure projects that can help combat climate change, holding African leaders accountable if they do invest in investments that are not profitable. And then the article does acknowledge about the leader of World Bank, AJ Banga, who does have the ability to address Africa's outdated technology. And then how did the first wave of globalization impact Africa? Well, during the 1500s, European imperialists exploited Africa's natural resources as they continued to want labor from Africa. There was the slave trade era, which disrupted Africans' population through slavery, and Africans did die from diseases during the slave trade era. They were restricted from practicing their own religion. And then during the second half of the 19th century, European imperialists exploited African leaders and excluded them from their own affairs. And so Africa poses challenges such as high rate of poverty as there's a shortage of food, energy, and transportation, as well as low GPD per capita. During the article Filling Africa's Data Gap, it really highlighted about the lack of infrastructure and the lack of transportation that Africa has. There's also an economic inequality between their workers, between high skilled and low skilled workers, as well as political instability, as there seems to be a high turnover for chief executives. And then, how does the sixth wave globalization affect Africa? Well, in the 1980s, Africa became a major exporter as they were introduced to the global economy. And Africa currently has 33 out of 54 less developed countries as they still continue to struggle with a high rate of poverty. Rising wages account for the fast growing population as they've been introduced to middle class societies, and then Africa faces unproductive loans and heavy debt burden still, as there seems to be a lack of infrastructure and a lack of transportation. And then currently the average government effective score for Africa is negative 82, comparing it to the US, which is 1.33. So there seems to be political instability within African leaders. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you.